June 13th, 1943, near Ferryville, Tunisia. The ground still held the day's heat, and the air smelled of dust and fuel, when Gefreiter Karl Weber lifted his hands and stepped from a stand of scrub into the open, boots sinking in powdery soil where tracked vehicles had bitten ruts through the afternoon. He had eaten almost nothing for 2 days. His canteen was nearly empty. He was 23 years old and could feel his heart beat in his ears as he watched American infantrymen fan out with practiced care, rifles up, fingers steady on triggers that did not waver even as a sergeant called to him in plain, careful German to drop the pistol he had tucked under his tunic. Karl did as he was told and felt the strange quiet that follows a decision you cannot take back. In the next minutes, he was searched with brisk efficiency and guided toward a shallow wadi where other prisoners sat in small groups under guard. What he noticed first was not the weapons or the confident posture of the men who had just taken him. It was the smell of coffee and something sweet carried on the evening breeze. An American private came past with a canvas bag. He stopped at Karl's group, crouched, and set down tins and hard biscuits and a slab of dark chocolate. The private's face was red from sun, and his helmet strap made a pale line on his cheek. He said one word that needed no translation. "Eat." Karl hesitated, then broke the biscuit and saw the fine white crumb that reminded him of peacetime bakeries. The chocolate softened in his fingers. He took a mouthful and felt a wave of relief move through his body that was so strong he wanted to close his eyes against it. Later that night, on a scrap of paper he would hide in a boot heel, he wrote a sentence in a cramped hand. "The enemy gave me bread and coffee before they asked my name." Around him, the last phase of the North African campaign was ending with numbers that would be studied for decades. Axis resistance in Tunisia had collapsed through May as Allied pressure closed a ring from the east and the west. The British Eighth Army pressing from Libya and the combined American and British forces driving from Algeria and Morocco after the November landings. Ferryville and Bizerte had fallen weeks earlier. The final surrender on the Cap Bon Peninsula concluded a campaign that had begun with the shock of new armies learning hard lessons and ended with a methodical encirclement. In the second week of May, hundreds of Germans and Italians laid down arms in clusters that grew by the hour, then by the thousand, until the figures settled into a scale that was hard to grasp from ground level. American and British reports recorded that more than 250,000 Axis soldiers were captured in Tunisia by mid-May. In some sectors, the numbers rose so quickly that field cages formed from concertina wire, and trucks could not be expanded fast enough to hold the new arrivals. Yet the Allied machine had been building for months, a system of intake that could process men on a scale that matched the stacks of crates and jerry cans that lined forward depots. Identification details were taken, weapons piled and tagged, and medical teams moved along the lines with clipboards and thermometers. Karl watched corpsmen bending to look at a wounded Italian's leg and then lifting him with a practiced grip that did not jolt the torn flesh. A young American officer with a German grammar book in a pocket asked each man in turn if he needed a doctor. The officer's vowels were heavy, but the meaning was clear. Behind this small scene lay numbers that did not fit into a single field of view. American quartermasters had shipped hundreds of thousands of individual rations across the Atlantic in the spring, and depots near Oran and Algiers held coffee in burlap sacks measured not by kilograms but by tons, and flour and sugar in quantities that fed entire armies. In that first hour of his captivity, Karl did not know the figures, only the taste of sugar on his tongue, and the way the American who handed him a tin of meat said quietly that night would be cooler if he moved nearer the low wall out of the wind. When darkness came, the guards lit hooded lanterns, and the temporary cage took on a muted glow. The night was full of sounds. Somewhere to the north, a generator ran with an even rhythm, and every few minutes a truck changed gears on the road toward Ferryville. The Americans divided the prisoners into platoon-sized groups and laid out a routine that felt like peacetime practice rather than improvisation. Water discipline was enforced, and the latrine line was marked. A corporal with a stubbled jaw explained through a German-speaking interpreter that the men would be moved at first light to a larger holding point near Matur. Then he surprised Karl with a question. Were there wounded among them beyond minor scrapes? A few hands lifted and the corporal called for a medic. The Allied approach to the flood of men coming into their hands had been shaped by agreements made years before, and by a logistical culture that treated rules and timetables as tools to be learned and applied. In the spring of 1943, American field kitchens in Tunisia heated coffee in drums cut lengthwise and set over fuel burners, and mess details carried real sugar and tins of condensed milk forward to any formation that had to work through the night. The rations that reached the intake cages were not lavish, and they were not intended to be a gesture. They were simply available. The daily allotment for a frontline American soldier at this stage of the war provided bread or biscuit, meat in a tin, coffee, sugar, and a small bar of chocolate, along with cigarettes and sometimes gum. The details shifted by unit and by day, but the calories tallied in the thousands, enough to keep a man at work with a pack on his shoulders and a weapon in his hands. When a portion was shared with prisoners, it was not part of a carefully planned psychological program. It was often the quickest way to keep men quiet and calm while guards waited for trucks or for daylight. It had, however, an effect that many Americans noticed. The gesture cut through fear and pride in a way that shouted orders could not. One American sergeant wrote to his wife that week that the prisoners looked at a cup of coffee as if it were a miracle, and that the best way to make a man stop thinking about flight was to put a full mess tin in his hands. Karl would later remember the shape of the tin more clearly than the faces of the guards and the faint sweetness that clung to the cup edge from the milk stirred into the coffee. With dawn, the intake site became part of a larger movement that looked orderly from the air and chaotic from the ground. Long columns of prisoners formed under armed escort and moved toward assembly areas where rows of trucks waited. Karl climbed into the back of a canvas-topped vehicle with 24 others. He felt the stiff boards under him as the truck lurched into line and began to roll. On the roadside, a water cart stood next to a stack of empty petrol tins, and beyond it, rows of parked vehicles stretched down the slope in pairs as far as he could see. He had once believed that his army, with its careful parade ground discipline and its early victories, had a monopoly on organization. He had believed many other things that morning. Now he sat with a cup of American coffee warming his hands and watched the convoy turn past a sign for Matur. The broad context was moving quickly. Allied staffs were already planning how to move the new prisoners far from the front and beyond any chance of returning to the fight. In the next weeks, thousands would be shipped from North African ports on merchant hulls that had carried tanks and fuel in the other direction. The same ships would return with men, moving across the Atlantic in guarded convoys protected by escort vessels that pushed U-boats away from the lanes with sonar and depth charges. Ports in Virginia, Louisiana, and New York would receive them, and trains would carry them into the interior to camps built on a scale that matched the new American way of war. That future was still a rumor in the cage near Ferryville, but the outline was visible. A lieutenant with an engineer badge on his cap spoke with a quartermaster captain near the trucks about the day's loads and the road condition. Each used clipped sentences and each looked at a clipboard full of figures. In this moment, the most important figure to Karl was the simplest one. The guard who had shared his rations the night before had filled his cup twice. The image stuck, not as an act of generosity in the abstract, but as a small, practical thing that kept him from shaking and kept his stomach from hurting. Years later, men who had been in that column would write that the first shock of captivity had been met by a tin of meat and a square of chocolate and a guard who asked, not in mockery, if they needed more water. One of them would copy a line from a British leaflet into his notebook and underline it. "You will be treated as you treat our men." It had been printed months earlier and dropped from the air. In the dust near Ferryville, it felt like a plain statement of fact. The journey south from the collection point took the prisoners through Mature, then to a rail junction where long trains waited under the supervision of military police. Karl Weber stood among rows of men in field-gray uniforms now covered in dust and sweat. Each held a numbered tag on a cord around his neck. When the train whistle sounded, a sergeant shouted instructions in English, and the guards moved the line forward. The car Karl climbed into was not a cattle wagon, but a passenger coach, its windows open to the hot air. The seats were wooden, the floor clean, and above each seat a rack held American duffel bags marked with names and unit numbers. The German prisoners sat awkwardly, waiting for insults or blows that never came. Instead, an American corporal walked through the car with a stack of brown paper packages. He placed one on every lap. Inside was a boxed meal, white bread sandwiches, a bar of chocolate, a small tin of meat, and a paper cup for coffee to be poured later. No guard spoke German well enough to explain, yet the meaning was unmistakable. They were being fed like soldiers, not starved like captives. For Karl, who had once believed that American soldiers were crude and lazy men propped up by machines, the scene was incomprehensible. He bit into the bread and tasted butter. For the first time since El Alamein, he ate without fear that the next mouthful would be his last for days. From the windows, he saw columns of trucks and tanks moving along parallel roads toward Bizerte, the same vehicles that had surrounded his division 2 weeks earlier. Each bore the white star of the U.S. Army painted bright against dust and grease. These convoys were only a small part of the great logistical river that had crossed the Atlantic. In the spring of 1943, more than 1.2 million American soldiers were deployed in North Africa and the Mediterranean, supplied by an industrial system that produced trucks faster than any other nation could repair them. For every American soldier in combat, 8 worked in supply or transport. Behind the front lines, ports at Oran and Algiers processed millions of tons of cargo monthly, food, ammunition, and fuel measured by the trainload. The Germans had mocked this capacity as wasteful, a symptom of decadence. Yet the efficiency of that system now surrounded the prisoners. It was expressed in details that no amount of propaganda could disguise. Hot meals, clean water, and discipline that ran on paper schedules instead of shouted orders. Karl did not yet understand that these details formed part of a larger strategy of psychological management. The U.S. War Department had issued strict directives that German prisoners were to be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention, not merely for moral reasons, but because fair treatment was expected to yield intelligence, cooperation, and long-term political dividends once the war ended. The train crossed the countryside toward a staging area near Oran, where the prisoners would be held before boarding ships bound for America. The landscape shifted from brown dust to low green hills, dotted with olive groves. The train slowed often, not for breakdowns, but for passing priority convoys. From his window, Karl counted trucks carrying gasoline drums, cranes loading crates, and ambulances marked with red crosses. Each represented the unimaginable scale of Allied logistics. The men around him whispered disbelief. Some thought this comfort was a trick meant to soften them for interrogation. Others guessed it was propaganda for later photographs. Yet when the train stopped that evening, and American guards distributed steaming cans of stew and cups of coffee, no cameras appeared. The guards ate the same food beside them. One private handed his own cup to a wounded German who had trouble lifting his hand. The smell of hot beans and meat filled the car. Karl watched as steam rose from the tin in his lap. Later, when the guards collected the empty cans, they gave the prisoners cigarettes. He kept his unlit, not knowing whether to smoke it or save it as proof that such moments existed. In the wider frame, that single train was one among dozens moving through North Africa that month. Between May and August 1943, the U.S. Army transported over 200,000 Axis prisoners to North African camps and then across the Atlantic on Liberty ships returning from supply runs. Each vessel carried up to 2,000 men in converted cargo holds. The logistics were managed with mathematical precision. Identity cards, vaccination records, medical inspections, and rations calculated down to the calorie. For Karl and the men around him, these measures blurred into a single impression of order and abundance. Even as prisoners, they were surrounded by a rhythm of activity that never faltered. At sunset, guards checked manifests under electric lamps powered by portable generators, while field kitchens brewed coffee in 50-gallon drums. In those same weeks, the Allied High Command prepared for the invasion of Sicily. Every trainload of prisoners that left Tunisia freed supply lines for new troops. Every ton of food sent to the camps was accounted for, and every captured German soldier became both a logistical burden and a moral witness to America's industrial might. Karl, sitting on the wooden seat with a cigarette tucked behind his ear, did not know these numbers. What he knew was that an American private named Jenkins, he caught the name from a patch, had pressed an extra slice of bread into his hand and said quietly, "You'll be fine now." He would remember that sentence for the rest of his life, written later in a diary entry that survived the war. They treated us as men before they called us prisoners. The ship that carried Karl Weber across the Atlantic departed from Oran on July 6, 1943. Its name, stenciled on the gray hull, was the SS Robert Rowan, a Liberty-class cargo vessel hastily converted for human transport. The prisoners were brought aboard in columns under the watch of armed guards, their boots ringing against the gangplank. Each man received a numbered tag and a paper ration card. Karl felt the vibration of engines deep within the ship's steel belly as he stepped into the converted hold. Instead of bare decks, rows of bunks had been built from pine boards stacked 4 tiers high, each with a thin mattress and a wool blanket. It was not comfort, but it was civilization after the desert. Before departure, an American officer addressed them in slow, deliberate German. They would be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention, he said. They would be given 3 meals a day, water, and medical attention. The officer's words seemed impossible, even insulting. Yet that evening, when the mess detail opened cans of beef stew and handed out white bread, Karl realized it was true. From the deck above, the smell of strong coffee drifted through the air shafts. Somewhere a phonograph played faint swing music. The ship's crew went about their duties with quiet professionalism, neither cruel nor friendly. simply efficient. As the convoy sailed westward, Karl was given short periods on deck for air and exercise. The sight of the sea left him speechless. He had never seen the Atlantic. In every direction stretched a horizon of blue-gray water. The convoy consisted of over 60 ships, liberty vessels, oil tankers, and destroyer escorts spaced in long rows. Black smoke trailed from their funnels, and the smell of diesel clung to the breeze. American sailors moved along the deck with practiced precision, scanning for the white plumes of U-boats that sometimes haunted these routes. They carried coffee mugs even during watch, a small ritual that fascinated the prisoners. To Karl, these men seemed unshakable. They joked softly, shared cigarettes, and worked through the night without shouting. The only alarm came one evening when depth charges exploded far astern, muffled thuds that shook the hull. The guards said nothing, and the ship kept its course. Karl wrote later that the Americans seemed to have tamed the sea itself. They had built so many ships that losing one no longer threatened the outcome of the war. It was true. By mid-1943, American shipyards were producing 3 new Liberty ships each day. More than 2,700 would be launched before war's end, a number that defied comprehension in the German mind, shaped by scarcity and rationing. In the hold, life settled into a rhythm. Each morning, a cook opened the hatch and lowered large tins of scrambled eggs and bacon. Coffee was served in metal cups that burned the hands. The prisoners lined up, ate in silence, and passed their tins back through the hatch. The guards shared the same food, occasionally tossing an extra biscuit to a man who looked thin. The contrast between this abundance and the German frontline rations was unbearable. In Africa, Karl's unit had received black bread, tinned horse meat, and ersatz coffee brewed from roasted barley. Here, in captivity, he ate more than he had during months of active service. Letters from home, written before his capture, had described women queuing for hours for half a loaf of bread. The thought that America could feed its prisoners better than Germany could feed its civilians planted a quiet unease that grew each day. The shock of plenty was stronger than fear. Karl watched the waste that seemed to mean nothing, scraps thrown overboard, cigarette ends dropped into the sea, gallons of coffee poured down the scuppers. At first it offended him. Later he understood it as proof of something vast. A supply chain so deep that individuals no longer worried about the next meal. He wrote, "They throw away what we dream of." After 2 weeks, the convoy approached the American coast. The ship's loudspeakers ordered all prisoners to prepare for disembarkation. When dawn came, Karl saw land for the first time. A coastline covered in mist, dotted with cranes and warehouses. It was Norfolk, Virginia, one of the largest naval bases in the world. The harbor stretched for miles. He counted ships as they passed. Freighters, tankers, warships. More vessels in one place than the entire German fleet could have mustered. Giant gantry cranes lifted cargo containers like toys. The docks teemed with workers, men and women both, wearing helmets and coveralls, driving trucks that moved in precise lines. Overhead, planes circled like insects. The noise was constant, a mechanical symphony of engines, horns, and steel. When the prisoners disembarked, the air smelled of oil and roasted coffee from canteens on the pier. American military police stood in formation, directing columns with calm efficiency. For Karl, this was the second great shock. The enemy was not exhausted by war. The enemy was thriving in it. The docks of Norfolk processed more tonnage in a single day than Hamburg had in an entire week before the bombing campaign. Even the small details felt impossible. soldiers wearing new boots, port workers drinking Coca-Cola from glass bottles, electric lamps burning at noon because electricity was plentiful. For the first time, Karl began to believe that Germany might truly lose. He saw no propaganda here, only the weight of reality measured in tons of steel and gallons of fuel. The Americans who shared their rations had not done so to prove kindness alone. They had done it because they could afford to. And that realization, more than any speech or leaflet, began to unmake everything he had been taught. The prisoners were marched in columns from the docks of Norfolk to the waiting trains. The air smelled of tar and salt and the metallic tang of diesel smoke. American guards walked beside the line, their rifles slung across their shoulders, not aimed. Civilians stopped to stare, and children perched on fences watched in silence. For many in that crowd, it was the first time they had seen the men who had fought their sons across oceans and deserts. Yet there was no hostility in the faces. Some women handed paper cups of lemonade to the guards, and one boy offered a cigarette to a prisoner until his mother sternly pulled him back. The contrast between fear and normal life stunned Karl Weber. Back home, Allied prisoners had been hidden from public view or displayed only as trophies of victory. Here, the defeated walked through a city that seemed untouched by war. Storefronts gleamed with glass. Cafes were open. Trams rattled past, carrying workers to evening shifts. On the train platform, porters in blue uniforms loaded luggage for civilian passengers, while military police guided the prisoners to waiting Pullman cars. The wooden interiors smelled of polish and tobacco smoke. Above each seat hung a small fan, and soft light glowed from electric bulbs even in the daytime. Karl sat by the window and pressed his hand to the glass. For the first time, he saw America not as propaganda, but as fact. The land outside was green and orderly, dotted with houses and fields. As the train began to move, he saw a billboard advertising washing machines and another for Coca-Cola. It was a country at war that seemed to have everything. For 3 days, the train moved steadily southwest. The prisoners received meals served on trays with coffee poured from metal pitchers. Each meal followed a pattern: bread, meat, vegetables, fruit, and coffee. The guards ate the same food beside them. The journey passed through North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, then into Texas. At night, the train stopped to refill its tanks, and the prisoners watched electric cranes loading coal and water. The lights never went out. In every small town, neon signs glowed even after midnight. To men who had lived under blackout orders for years, the sight was both wondrous and humiliating. One of Karl's companions, a former engineer named Otto, whispered that Germany had already lost. When asked why, he pointed to a passing freight yard lit brighter than any airfield they had ever seen. "They have light to waste," he said quietly. The other men said nothing. They had no words for the abundance that surrounded them. In Germany, even officers' quarters were dark after dusk. Here, warehouses and factories burned electricity without pause. The American guards seemed unaware of how extraordinary this looked. To them, it was normal. They played cards, passed around newspapers, and told jokes as the countryside rolled by. Karl stared out the window at the endless farms and the cars moving along distant highways. Even the smallest houses had lights, cars, and washing lines full of clean clothes. He began to realize that the strength of this country lay not in its weapons, but in its ordinary people, who lived better in wartime than most Germans had in peace. On the third afternoon, the train stopped at a siding near Mexia, Texas. The landscape stretched wide and flat, dotted with mesquite trees. A line of military trucks waited beyond the tracks, and beyond them stood the low wooden buildings of Camp Hearn. The heat hit them like a wall as they stepped down from the cars. American officers checked names against lists, then directed the prisoners through the gate. Inside the wire, Karl saw barracks arranged in perfect rows, each with wooden steps and screened windows. There were water towers, latrines, a hospital, and even a small chapel. What astonished him most was the electricity. Light bulbs hung in every barrack. Ceiling fans turned slowly. In one corner of the compound, prisoners worked in a kitchen equipped with gleaming gas stoves. The smell of cooking drifted through the air. Meat, onions, coffee. The men stared in disbelief. The guards explained that they would cook their own meals from American rations delivered daily from nearby depots. Each man would receive the same caloric allotment as a U.S. soldier, about 3,000 calories a day. The Geneva Convention required fairness, but the Americans went further. They provided flour, sugar, coffee, milk, and even canned fruit. The camp doctor, a U.S. Army major, inspected each man for lice and infection. Those with fevers were sent to the infirmary, which had running water and real hospital beds. Karl felt a faint shame when the American medic handed him a tablet of aspirin. He had not seen a supply that generous since 1940. By the second week, the camp began to feel like a small town. Prisoners built shelves, hung laundry, and organized classes. The Americans allowed them to form work detachments on nearby farms, where they picked cotton or harvested wheat for local growers. Each received 80 cents worth of credit per day, which could be spent in the camp canteen on tobacco or stationery. The guards were firm but not cruel. Many were older reservists or men recovering from wounds, more interested in routine than punishment. One, a sergeant from Oklahoma, often brought leftover biscuits from the mess hall and shared them with the prisoners who worked in the garden. He joked that it kept the vegetables growing faster. Karl never forgot the casual ease with which the man shared food. It was not pity, it was habit. In Germany, food had been guarded like treasure. Here it was part of life, as ordinary as air. When the Red Cross arrived to inspect the camp, the representatives reported that conditions exceeded the minimum standard in every category: housing, nutrition, hygiene, and recreation. The report noted with some irony that the German prisoners were eating better than many Allied soldiers in the field. For Karl, the realization was almost unbearable. He had entered captivity believing that surrender was the end of dignity. Instead, it became the beginning of understanding. Every meal shared, every cup of coffee poured by a guard, chipped away at the illusions that had carried him through war. The Americans had defeated him not only with machines and numbers, but with something he could not explain: generosity grounded in power. By late August 1943, the rhythms of life inside Camp Hearn had become steady. Each morning, the prisoners stood for roll call under the Texas sun. The sky was enormous, the air already warm before dawn, and dust lifted from the packed earth as hundreds of boots moved in formation. Karl Weber lined up with men from his transport, his shirt open at the throat. Beyond the wire, American soldiers walked the perimeter, rifles slung casually. Their presence felt less like menace than routine. After roll call came breakfast: oatmeal, bread, coffee. The food was served by fellow prisoners assigned to kitchen duty, using ingredients delivered by American quartermasters from depots in Houston and Dallas. Every week, trucks brought in sacks of flour, potatoes, tinned meat, and vegetables grown on nearby farms. The supply never faltered. Karl had once thought war meant rationing and deprivation for all sides. Here, he saw the opposite. Even as the world burned, America had managed to produce enough to feed millions, including its enemies. The camp's work program sent groups of prisoners into the surrounding countryside. Farmers requested labor through the War Department, and every morning, open-bed trucks carried men to the fields. Karl was assigned to a cotton farm near Waco. The first time he saw the machinery there, he felt as though he had stepped into another century. Giant steel harvesters rolled through the fields, their engines humming. The farmer, a broad-shouldered man in overalls, greeted them politely and explained their tasks in slow, accented English. His wife brought out pitchers of cold water and sandwiches for both workers and guards. When she realized the prisoners were not given lunch rations that day, she insisted they eat. Karl remembered how she pressed food into their hands, thick slices of white bread, ham, and pickles, and smiled as if it were nothing. The German soldiers, who had once marched through occupied towns taking what they wanted, now stood silent before a woman who gave freely. That night, back in camp, Karl wrote in his diary, "They fed us as if we were neighbors, not prisoners." It was a thought he could not easily reconcile with what he had been taught. Beyond the wire, America's war production surged to unimaginable heights. In the summer of 1943, American factories produced more than 8,000 aircraft, 20,000 tanks, and nearly 500,000 rifles. Women filled assembly lines in Detroit and Chicago, welding and riveting through long shifts. The Alcoa plant in Tennessee consumed more electricity than the entire city of Munich to produce aluminum for aircraft. To the prisoners, this industrial might was visible even in small ways. The trucks that delivered food to the camp bore fresh paint and unblemished tires, luxuries unheard of in wartime Europe. Every evening, freight trains thundered past, loaded with supplies for other bases. Karl learned from a talkative guard that the same trains carried mail and candy for American troops overseas. The idea that soldiers at the front might still receive chocolate and cigarettes was almost incomprehensible. Germany had stopped issuing real coffee years earlier. Substitutes made from roasted barley or acorns were all that remained. Yet here, even the camp mess served coffee so strong it made his hands tremble. The guards treated it as nothing special. They filled cups without counting, sometimes offering seconds. In those moments, Karl realized that the wealth of America was not confined to cities or generals. It was embedded in the daily life of ordinary people. As autumn arrived, the Texas fields turned gold, and the camp prepared for harvest work. The prisoners' routines grew easier, their guards more relaxed. Small privileges appeared: the right to write letters home, to play soccer inside the compound, to read newspapers. American officers allowed a camp newspaper written in German, Der Ruf, which published poems, essays, and even debates about the future of Germany. For Karl, the act of reading freely, without censorship, felt almost dangerous. He had been raised to believe that information was to be controlled, that obedience was a virtue. Now, he saw Americans distributing magazines and books without fear. One article in Life magazine passed between prisoners showed photographs of American families at Sunday picnics, smiling beside new cars. The caption claimed that 27 million American households owned automobiles, a figure so high it sounded absurd. When Karl asked a guard if it was true, the man laughed and said, "Probably more now." That casual answer stayed with him. Back home, even doctors and party officials rarely owned cars. In the evenings, the camp lights glowed across the plain, powered by the same electric grid that served local towns. The lights never dimmed. For Karl, who had once trudged through blackout cities under Allied bombing, that unbroken light symbolized something larger, a country confident enough to leave the bulbs burning. America's strength was not just in weapons or wealth. It was in the ordinary certainty that there would always be enough. By November 1943, the first cold winds of winter reached central Texas, and the cotton fields turned brown. Camp Hearn's prisoners, now seasoned laborers and farmhands, began to see the small cycles of American life continue untouched by war. Karl Weber was assigned to a new work detail near Bryan, where German prisoners helped harvest sorghum and mend fences. Each morning they were driven through the mist in open trucks, guards seated at the front, rifles resting casually across their knees. The local farmers greeted them as workers, not as enemies. One elderly farmer, Mr. Dawson, kept a jug of buttermilk under the truck's shade and offered it to everyone at midday. On weekends, he invited the guards and even the prisoners to eat together under a shed roof when the day's work was done. There were platters of corn, biscuits, fried chicken, and sweet tea. The food was plain, but its abundance defied everything Karl had imagined about wartime America. Once, while they ate, the farmer's wife asked where in Germany they were from. Her tone was so casual that Karl struggled to answer. For the first time, he understood what it meant to live without fear of scarcity. The woman filled their plates twice and said simply, "You boys work hard. You should eat well." Inside the camp, American officers began organizing education programs. Universities such as the University of Chicago and Stanford sent correspondence materials for history, mathematics, and English courses. Karl enrolled in a basic English class taught by a young interpreter from Iowa. The classroom was a converted barrack with chalkboards hung on wooden frames. They practiced vocabulary using phrases from everyday life. "Please pass the bread," "Where's the farm?" Simple lines that carried hidden meaning. Each word pulled Karl closer to the rhythm of a country that spoke plainly and lived abundantly. The library shelves filled with donated books, Moby Dick, Huckleberry Finn, and technical manuals for mechanics. Prisoners debated literature in low voices, amazed that they could discuss American authors without censorship. The contrast with Germany's intellectual climate was stark. There, discussion of unapproved writers could lead to arrest. Here, even prisoners were trusted to read freely. This liberty began to reshape their thinking. The old Nazi slogans carved into some men's minds started to sound absurd beside the evidence of American reality. They saw guards who treated black soldiers and white soldiers with more equality than any system in Europe allowed. They saw women operating supply trucks and running offices. Every sight was a contradiction of what propaganda had once promised them. As Christmas approached, the camp took on a strange warmth. The Red Cross distributed parcels containing cigarettes, chocolate, soap, and writing paper. Local church groups sent gifts and letters addressed to a German prisoner. On Christmas Eve, a Methodist choir from Hearn performed carols outside the wire. The songs were familiar. "Silent Night," "O Come All Ye Faithful," but sung in English, with deep, clear voices that carried through the cold air. Karl stood among hundreds of men listening quietly. Many wept, though none admitted it. Afterward, the camp kitchen served roast turkey, potatoes, and pie. The guards ate with them at long tables under stringed lights powered by a generator. Karl had never eaten so much food in his life. He remembered that, during the same winter, his mother in Hamburg had written of standing in line for turnips and black bread. Here, even the prisoners had fruit and coffee. That night, he wrote in his diary, "If this is defeat, then it tastes of mercy." The gesture had not been planned as propaganda. It was part of an ordinary American belief that generosity toward enemies was proof of civilization. Yet for Karl and thousands like him, it marked a quiet turning point. The hatred that had fueled their obedience began to fade, replaced by confusion and a reluctant admiration. Beyond the barbed wire, the war pressed on. In Europe, Allied bombers darkened German skies nightly. In the Pacific, the battle for Tarawa raged. American production reached levels unmatched in history. 95,000 planes in 1943 alone, 65,000 tanks, 8 million tons of shipping. The same factories that built tanks and planes also produced the rations that fed the men in Texas. From Chicago's stockyards to Louisiana's rice mills, food poured across the nation's rail lines toward ports, fronts, and prison camps. The arithmetic of abundance was staggering. Every American soldier received about 4 pounds of food per day. Every German prisoner, 3.5. For the United States, this equality was strategic, proof that democratic systems could treat enemies humanely without losing strength. For Karl, it was deeply personal. Each shared ration eroded the boundaries of ideology. He no longer saw the Americans as caricatures of chaos or weakness. He saw them as men shaped by a country so vast and confident that it had room even for its enemies. When lights flickered on across the compound that night, he realized how far he had traveled, not just in miles, but in belief. The enemy who fed him had become the mirror in which he saw his own nation's failure. Spring of 1944 brought new changes to Camp Hearn. The war in Europe had shifted dramatically. The Allies had landed at Anzio in January and were preparing for an invasion of France. Yet in Texas, the seasons turned quietly, marked only by blooming fields and the steady hum of machinery in the camp workshops. Karl Weber's English had improved enough that he could read American newspapers, and he followed the war from afar, through headlines about ships launched, towns liberated, and factories breaking new records. He had stopped hoping for Germany's victory months ago. What replaced that hope was harder to name, a mixture of awe, humility, and a strange peace that came from routine. He now worked in the camp carpentry shop, repairing furniture and building crates for nearby farms. The Americans treated skilled prisoners as craftsmen, allowing them access to tools and workbenches. Each day began with the same sound of saws and hammers. Overhead, electric lights burned even during daylight hours. Karl often caught himself staring at them, still amazed that such brightness could be so constant. He could not imagine a German workshop that would leave bulbs lit without concern for cost. Every gesture of plenty, from extra nails to hot coffee brought in by guards, reminded him that this nation's wealth was not an illusion. It was a living system. Letters from home arrived in April. His mother wrote from Hamburg that food was scarcer than ever, the city blackened by air raids, the bread mixed with sawdust flour. She had queued 4 hours for potatoes and received only 2 kilograms. Karl read her words slowly, his throat tightening. That evening, he wrote back describing the camp in careful, neutral language, leaving out any detail that would sound unbelievable. He could not bring himself to write that he drank milk daily, or that he ate meat every week. The censors would have struck those lines, and his mother might have thought he had lost his mind. Still, he hinted at his gratitude by writing, I am treated well. You must not worry. In truth, he felt guilty for how well he lived while his country suffered. That guilt, mixed with wonder, became the emotional ground of his transformation. He spent long hours thinking about what had gone wrong, how a nation so proud of its discipline and intellect had led its sons into ruin, while the supposed decadent enemy built a paradise of industry and compassion. Sometimes at night, he would walk to the wire and look at the lights of Herne Town glowing beyond the fields. Each light, he thought, represented a home, a job, a meal, all functioning while the world elsewhere tore itself apart. In May, American officers introduced discussion groups for prisoners interested in learning about democratic government. The program, quietly directed by the War Department's Special Projects Division, aimed to re-educate German soldiers through exposure rather than lectures. Karl joined hesitantly, curious more than committed. The meetings took place in the camp recreation hall, where a chalkboard displayed quotes from the U.S. Constitution and from Thomas Jefferson. The officer leading the session was a former schoolteacher from Ohio. He spoke simply about elections, free speech, and the idea that authority should serve the people, not rule them. At first, the Germans listened in silence. Then questions came. Wasn't democracy weak? Didn't it collapse in chaos before Hitler restored order? The officer answered each question with examples from his own country, how it had survived depression, war, and dissent without destroying itself. Order, he said, is not strength if it depends on fear. Karl sat motionless, realizing that everything he had believed since boyhood had been built on that very fear. The words struck him more deeply because they were not shouted, not even preached. They were spoken with calm conviction by a man who had no reason to hate him. By summer, Karl's outlook had changed completely. He no longer saw himself as a prisoner, but as a witness to something profound. Each day of American normalcy chipped away at the remnants of the old ideology. When he watched a guard offer a cigarette to a fellow prisoner, or a nurse tend to a sick man without distinction, he understood that this was not propaganda, it was habit. The same habits that built factories, fed armies, and lit entire towns were the habits that made these people treat their enemies decently. In June 1944, news of the Normandy landings reached Camp Herne. The announcement was made over a loudspeaker, followed by silence. The German prisoners knew instantly what it meant. The war was entering its final act. Some men hung their heads, others stared into space. Karl felt no rage, only resignation and a faint relief. The guards treated the day like any other, distributing dinner, beans, cornbread, and coffee, and offering seconds to anyone still hungry. That evening, as the sun went down over the Texas plain, Karl wrote in his notebook for the last time that year, "They have defeated us without hatred. They have conquered us with bread." The war would continue for another year, and the men of Camp Herne would not return home until 1946. Many, including Karl, would carry into post-war Germany a vision of the world reshaped by what they had seen in America. They would tell their families that defeat had brought education, that captivity had taught them the meaning of freedom. History would record these camps not as places of suffering, but as classrooms of democracy built from light bulbs, coffee, and shared rations. For Karl Weber, the moment that began, it all remained vivid until his death decades later. The evening near Ferryville, when an American soldier, sweating in his dusty uniform, had placed a tin of meat and a bar of chocolate in his hands without a word. In that gesture lay the first crack in the armor of belief. What had started as captivity had ended as revelation, proof that the most powerful weapons of war could be neither guns nor bombs, but humanity sustained by abundance.